Do you ever get restless at night thinking of all the who, what, when, where, why of the world? We do too. Thank you for joining us to talk about some of our midnight trips down the rabbit hole topics. If you're here listening from the start, thank you. We're so excited to be able to pull our passions for history together and be able to learn about new topics and educate others. If you're here in the future watching, hi, we've been best friends for over 10 years and happen to both be named Skylar. With that, let's get into today's topic. So where does the term sugar daddy come from? Well, the answer to that seems to be threefold. There's the sweet couple, no pun intended, that coined the saying, the Kanzi, and then there's the murder that popularized the phrase sugar daddy. The Victorian term has aged well. The term has appeared in numerous songs, including Fleetwood Mac's 1975 hit. I feel like we all know what a sugar daddy is. The noun. A sugar daddy means a rich older man who lavishes gifts on a young woman in return for her company or sexual favors. But let's dig a little deeper than that. The word sugar has been used as a slang word for money and luxury since the mid-19th century and defines the relationship between the couple. The word daddy was slang among sex workers for an older man since the 16th century and refers to the age difference between the two. It is important to note that the sugar lifestyle grew in popularity due to the flapper girl culture in the Roaring Twenties. The first recorded use of the word was on March 27th, 1923, in the Syracuse Herald in an episode of the story Fat Anna's Future. Interestingly, its famous introduction to the American public would come in the following day's newspaper. The story had actually begun 2 weeks before, when the body of Dorothy Keenan King was found in her New York apartment. So let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about Alma and Adolf Spreckels and their story. Adolf Spreckels was heir to a sugar fortune and was affectionately called Sugar Daddy by his wife Alma. Adolf was 24 years older than Alma.
Adolf was born on January 5, 1857 in San Francisco. His father, Klaus Spreckels, was the founder of Spreckels Sugar Company in California's San Joaquin Valley. His California sugar refinery processed sugarcane imported from Hawaii, the Philippines, China, and Java. In 1881, when the company was founded, Adolf would be named vice president, becoming president after the passing of his father. He was said to be extremely loyal to both his father and his brother John. In 1884, he shot Michael H. DeYoung, the co-founder of the San Francisco Chronicle, supposedly because of an article in the newspaper suggesting his family was monopolizing the sugar trade. Apparently, Adolf only stopped shooting when another Chronicle employee shot him in the arm. Spreckels pleaded temporary insanity to the charge of attempted murder and was acquitted. Adolf was also president of the San Francisco and San Mateo Electric Railway, vice president of both the Western Sugar Company and the Oceanic Steamship Company, as well as a director of the Sunset Monarch Company. Spreckels also served as San Francisco's park commissioner and was heavily involved with the development of Golden Gate Park. Spreckels Lake in the park is named after him. Spreckels Organ Pavilion in San Diego's Balboa Park, home to the largest outdoor pipe organ in the world, was also built by Spreckels and his brother John. Furthermore, his brother John commissioned Spreckels' organ in honor of Adolf, who died before it was actually completed. An additional fun fact about Mr. Spreckels is that he was really into horse racing. He owned and bred quite a few horses and even owned and bred the first California horse to win the Kentucky Derby, named Morvich, in 1921. Morvich was the 13th Kentucky Derby winner to win the race as his first start of the season. No Derby winner has done that again since then. Alma Spreckels, also called Big Alma, due to her tall stature of being 6 feet tall, was born Alma Charlotte de Bretteville in 1881 to Danish immigrants. Her father was a descendant of Franco-Danish nobility. From an early age, Alma learned what it took to have a strong work ethic. Growing up in a household where her father claimed to have royal blood and refused to work, she watched her mother run 3 family businesses, a bakery, laundry service, and massage parlor out of their home. Encouraged by her father, Alma dropped out of school at 14 to become a stenographer, but she knew early on her true passions lay with the art. She attended some classes at the Mark Hopkins Institute of Art, known today as San Francisco Art Institute. Due to her height and good looks, Alma found herself being propositioned to model for the arts. Her willingness to pose nude made her popular, financially comfortable, and totally infamous. However, Alma knew she wanted more in life than modeling. Alma met the man she was looking for, an ex-miner named Charlie Anderson. She quickly became Anderson's mistress, but when Anderson refused to marry Alma, she sued him for personal deflagration, and she surprisingly won. Alma didn't win the $50,000 that she had originally asked for, but walked away with $1,250, which is about $30,000 in today's market. Soon after, she had her most well-known modeling gig, which occurred when she was hired to model posing for Robert Atkin, a sculptor who was commissioned to create a statue in honor of the American victory in Manila Bay. Atkins' design required a model for the Greek goddess Nike. Honestly, who better to represent the goddess of victory than a woman who had won a lawsuit for $30,000 after losing her virginity to the wrong guy? The gig for the Dewey Monument, which was monumental for her in more ways than one because it would display Alma in the heart of San Francisco forever, but it was also how she met her husband and literal sugar daddy, Adolph Spreckels. Despite the 24-year age gap, it seems the couple had finally met their matches. Both had a checkered past. They dated pretty seriously for about 5 years until Adolph finally gave in to Alma's demands to be married. Why was he so hesitant? Well, there are definitely some reasons that we'll get into later. In 1908, the two married. After they married, Alma began to affectionately refer to Adolph as her sugar daddy. The following year, in 1909, their daughter Alma Emma Spreckels was born, and in 1911, Alma gave birth to a son, Adolph Bernard Jr. The family's massive Beaux Arts style mansion was completed in 1913, complete with the luxury of a staff of nannies and servants. Alma began to focus her attention away from the children and more towards the role of a proper high-class hostess. Not an easy feat considering the most of San Francisco's power elite turned their noses up at the free-thinking and bold woman whose humble origins and association with bohemian artists caused controversy in an era of stifling Victorian mores. Alma enjoyed all of the material benefits of her new social standing, but was often snubbed by those who were easily offended by her shady past. I guess that's just the time period we're talking about. If someone didn't fit the mold, they were given the cold shoulder. The couple's last child, Dorothy Constance, was born in March of 1913, and this is when Adolph's health began a downward spiral due to his progressing condition of syphilis. He knew he had syphilis before they were married. This was why he was so reluctant to marry Alma. Alma was determined to have the family climb up the social ladder. She arrived in Paris initially planning to shop for 18th century furniture. While on her travels, Alma met Louis Fuller at a dinner party held at the exclusive Parisian restaurant Ciro's. Alma became enthralled by the dance artist's colorful life and friendships with continental aristocracy, and Louis felt great affection towards the wealthy American socialite who, with Louis's contacts and encouragement, would turn into one of the most important art collectors in America. Through Louis, Alma met Auguste Rodin, a sculptor whose work left quite the impression on Alma. She started an art collection that would become one of the finest in the world. Alma returned to San Francisco just as World War I was starting, and immediately set out to purchase the work of Arthur Putnam. She proudly displayed some of her art at the Panama Pacific International Exposition, a world's fair celebrating the completion of the Panama Canal and San Francisco's rebirth from the ashes of the 1906 earthquake. A temporary French pavilion was created for the fair, and Alma fell in love with it. She ordered an exact replica of it to be created to hold art collection, and thus the Palace of the Legion of Honor Museum was created. After the exposition, Alma dove into charity work. With some convincing, the reluctant Adolph agreed to fund Alma's museum project, which she envisioned not only as a cultural gift to the city, but also as a tribute to the 3,600 soldiers from California who were killed during World War I. She made a return trip to Europe and secured financial support and art donations for her museum from the French government. She also met Louis Fuller's close friend, Queen Marie of Romania, who agreed to donate a replica of her Byzantine golden broom. Near the end of her trip, President Harding cabled Alma and asked her to go on a fact-finding mission about working conditions for women in post-war Europe for the U.S. Labor Department's Women's Bureau. She obliged his request and well-received report. She then retained the services of her trusted architect, George Applegarth, to work on designing her new museum to be located in Lincoln Park. His design, a three-quarter scale adaptation of the original Palace of the Legion of Honor in Paris, was accepted, and after 5 years of construction, the French neoclassical structure opened in 1924. With a grieving Alma presiding at the opening ceremony without her husband, who had died of pneumonia just 6 months earlier. After Adolf's death, Alma was shattered and spent much of her time collecting and fundraising for various causes, but needed a new project she could really throw herself into. Alma found that passion project in distressed Parisian-themed hotel she wanted to renovate. It was during this time that Alma also met a rancher named Elmer All. Alma and All fell fast in love, had a whirlwind romance, and got married, but soon afterwards Alma discovered Elmer was having an affair with her niece, Ola. In 1968, Alma Spreckels died of pneumonia at 87 years old, but her impact on the city of San Francisco and the art world will live on forever. The mansion she lived in until her death is now owned by romance author Danielle Steele. To this day, Alma is known as the great-grandmother of San Francisco. In 1932, the term sugar daddy was used as the name of a candy made by the Spreckels Candy Company. By 1932, Adolf had taken over the Spreckels candy business and changed the name of their candy, known as the Papa Sucker, to the name Sugar Daddy. Therefore, you can associate the term and its definition to Alma, who was the first ever to use it.
Let's circle back a little bit to the year 1923 and discuss the unsolved murders that popularized Alma's cute little nickname for Adolf. On March 15, 1923, Dorothy King was found murdered in her West 57th Street apartment in New York City. Unfortunately, Dot King was more famous dead than she was when she was alive. She was a former model with a shady tie to gangsters, to stage door Johns, and to Wall Street. Dot was a modern flapper, proven by her bobbed blonde hair and gold silk bandeau that she sported around her forehead when cutting a rug in her dazzling jewels, elegant gowns, and furs. Dot was born Anna Marie Keenan in 1894 to poor Irish immigrants in Harlem, New York. At 19 years old, the young, petite, blonde, blue-eyed beauty left her home with aspirations to become a Broadway actress. She was, as reported, put in a girl who lived on the bubbles of life, meaning that Dot lived a lifestyle that we would consider to be a stereotypical flapper of the roaring 20s. She was briefly married to a chauffeur, and it was through her husband that she gained access to Manhattan's social scene. But their marriage didn't last long because he caught her cheating. She was a model and a Broadway actress with a very attractive social life. She appeared in only one Broadway production, Broadway Bravities of 1920, which played at the Winter Garden Theater for 105 performances in autumn of winter of 1920. While her family believed she was working as a model and was an aspiring Broadway actress, Dot actually left both modeling and Broadway behind. During Prohibition, she became the hostess of a speakeasy and soon saw her name in the press, usually accompanied by the nickname of the Broadway Butterfly. Dot began her career as a model, and modeling was very different than it is now 100 years ago. Dot didn't strut down a runway like we would tend to envision, but she wore outfits around the couture shop so customers could see what the clothing looked like on a real person. The job demanded that she would conform to a set of beauty standards, but they were, of course, very different from today's. This is about the time she decided to change her name to Dorothy King, using her mother's maiden name, to hopefully attract opportunities in a career of theater. She soon became one of the most admired beauties in the wealthy cliques of Manhattan. She was associated with very powerful and wealthy men. Dot became a hostess at a speakeasy. This gig would soon be her downfall. Prohibition and the bootleggers who defied it made Dorothy's nightlife experiences exciting and dangerous. Bootlegging brought in money, and it attracted men that didn't always have the best intentions. This brought potentially dangerous figures into her life. These men had the most money, so obviously Dot wanted to run in that crowd. She had a number of beaux, including the son of President Harding, supposedly, Philadelphia socialite whose name was John Kearsley Mitchell, a 50-something who just happened to be the son-in-law of the head of the prestigious Drexel Bank.
John Mitchell went to great lengths to keep this relationship on the download because blackmail was a popular pastime in those days. They didn't stop him from showering the Broadway butterfly with extravagant gifts, and there was also a man named Draper Daugherty, the son of the United States Attorney General Harry Daugherty. Mitchell was rich, and the interplay between him and his embarrassed and even wealthier in-laws fascinated the press, particularly since police found his yellow silk pajamas in the deceased's apartment. The press really loved the drama. I guess nothing's changed since then. Like we said, she was involved with quite a few rich, older married men. Her beaux presented her with jewelry said to be worth $15,000, which is worth almost $250,000 in today's money. She also was linked to Alberto Santos Guimarães, a steel businessman who lived with Dot, well, at least 5 nights a week he did. The other 2 nights a week, Dot spent the night with a man she called Mr. Marshall, the man who paid for her top floor apartment at 144 West 57th Street on these nights. Alberto had to find other arrangements. We can guess where Guimarães was on those other 2 nights a week because, unbeknown to Dot, Guimarães was also romancing a rich socialite named Oriella Dreyfus. In 1922, he beat Dot for the very first time. She was later seen with bruises and a black eye. Her friends begged her to leave him, but she replied sadly, "Someday, Alberto will marry me." Mitchell and Guimarães were the only 2 men Dorothy entertained at her apartment.
When the 28-year-old Dot was found, she was poisoned to death with chloroform in her brownstone apartment, laying in her bed. She was draped in her yellow silk nightgown, with her face scratched and her mouth burned by the chloroform. At first glance, she looked like she was sleeping, but it was 11:30 a.m. This is exactly what her maid thought when she found her with her head half buried under the pillow and one arm dangling over the edge. Her other arm was behind her back, but the maid, Billy Bradford, didn't notice that detail until she first came into the bedroom at 11:30 that Thursday morning and found her mistress seemingly passed out. Dot partied on a nightly basis, so it wouldn't be out of the ordinary to find Dot passed out from another long night at the speakeasies. It wasn't until her maid Billy, while cleaning the room, accidentally touched Dot's foot and felt how cold she was, did she actually realize her mistress was dead. Before contacting the authorities, Bradford tampered with the crime scene. Whether she realized what she was doing could be debated. The window was open when she arrived. She closed it, probably to make herself more comfortable in the apartment. There had been record-breaking low temperatures the previous night. She washed drinking glasses with fingerprints on them. She also found a pair of men's pajamas and stashed them underneath the couch. Some suggest that she did this to protect Dot's reputation, but we don't know for sure. Friends and neighbors walked around the apartment for hours before authorities had a chance to survey it for evidence. Of course, forensic science were not the same as they are today. Even if it had been perfectly preserved, it is unlikely that the prosecution would have found their suspects using forensics from the time of the crime. At the start of the investigation, murder wasn't the first conclusion that people jumped to. The first doctor who arrived at the scene thought it was an accidental overdose or suicide. Chloroform was used as a recreational drug back then, and a bottle was found next to her body. Dot wouldn't have been the first party girl to have used the chloroform to take her own life. The fact that Dot's will was laid out on a table seemed to confirm this diagnosis. There was no cotton or gauze that Dot could have used to overdose on the chemical. It is almost impossible to chloroform to commit suicide. The drug requires small, regular doses administered over time to achieve unconsciousness. The harshness of the gas also prevents a person from smothering themselves with a deep breath. The intern had not noticed that her arm wrenched behind her back in a hammer lock hold, or that the chloroform bottle was found between her legs, not exactly the place it would drop if she had done it herself. He did not consider the apartment had been ransacked. It wasn't until another professional examined the body that the authorities learned that it was absolutely a homicide. Dr. Charles Casassa pointed out that Dot's arm had been bent into an unnatural position behind her back. The backside of her body was also covered in bruises. There were marks around her neck indicating she'd been strangled. He notified the chief medical examiner, Dr. Charles Norris. Norris's autopsy determined that there was no alcohol in Dot's system and that she had not engaged in sexual activity. Law enforcement seemed to be dragging their feet for some reason. The murder itself set apart from others in the area at the time because of the lack of details and clues. It appeared that Dot had come from a night out on the town with one of her gentleman callers and decided to head to bed after he, whoever he was, left. No one was seen entering the elevator after 2:30, according to John Thomas, the elevator attendant. There was no other way to make it upstairs without using the elevator. It seems unlikely that the killer climbed through a window because Dot's apartment was on the top floor, and a fire escape that did not connect to her bedroom, even if there was a fire escape, is up for debate.
It is definitely possible she was the victim of a burglary gone wrong because around $15,000 worth of jewelry was missing and the room had been ransacked as if someone was looking for something. That and there was a pattern of similar crimes in the Manhattan area, most notably the Irene Sholkoff case a few months prior. Irene was also chloroformed at her New Year's Eve party, and $300,000 worth of jewels were taken. However, fortunately for Irene, she had survived. The term sugar daddy was used by Daily News columnist Julia Hartman during this time in reference to Dot's murder case. The details of her life leading up to the killing gave wide-eyed readers a peek into the strange little-known woman, exposing a two-faced world of high society, and thus with it came the popularization of the term sugar daddy. Her rags to riches saga seemed to envelop all the vices and excesses of the Roaring Twenties, while also revealing the corruption at the heart of the Prohibition era. Dorothy became a symbol of the gold-digging schemer. The media released clues that were uncovered at the scene. A man's comb found on the bed, two fur coats on the floor, a pair of men's yellow silk pajamas tucked into the sofa, a black umbrella with some cotton stuck to it was also found near the door, and of course, the ominous piece of evidence, a will and testament found on a nearby table. This read, I, Dorothy Keenan, believing that something unforeseen might happen to me, hereby bequeath all my worldly possessions to my mother. This doesn't necessarily point to murder, but it sure is suspicious. It's strange the killer would have just left this there. It makes me wonder what was going on with Dot's will and her state of mind before all of this happened. Why was this found at the scene of the murder? What does she mean by unforeseen? Did someone want her dead? Was she being threatened? Why was the will just sitting there out in the open, exposed and not put away? Did her mother plant it there? And if so, to what degree might she have been involved in this whole thing? Some think the likeliest suspect was an elusive figure named Mr. Marshall, who had paid calls on Dot King frequently over the past year and was rumored to be paying her rent. Mr. Marshall had lavished Dot with expensive gifts, such as diamonds and furs. He would show up at her place with a bottle of champagne draped in a string of pearls. He would also shower her with savings bonds worth $1,000. Dot had invested the money, and authorities claimed with the stocks had bought a car for her brother's cabbie business and a vacation place in Atlantic City for her mother. She had bank accounts and safety deposit boxes all over the city. It was Mr. Marshall's pajamas that Billy had found the morning of the murder and had stashed away, allegedly out of respect for her in the process. Or was it more for his protection? If he was paying Dot's rent, as the press kept insisting, couldn't he have also been paying Billy's salary? These speculations were never fully explained or really looked into. The Mr. Marshall character never appeared with Dot unless he had his attorneys with him, a tall, thin man named Mr. Wilson, whose real name was John H. Jackson. The two would arrive at Dot's building. Then Wilson would scope out the lobby and elevator to make sure no one was there. When the coast was clear, Marshall would go to Dot's flat, tipping the elevator boy for his discretion. Then, after a brief interaction, Mr. Wilson would leave, either wait in the car or go home, and Marshall would remain with Dot. Even more strangely, Wilson's involvement went beyond scouting and meeting places. He too was friendly with Dot. On the night before the murder, the three of them had had dinner together at the fashionable Brevoort Hotel in Greenwich Village, where Marshall had met Dorothy, hardly a location one would choose for a clandestine affair.
A short time after the murder, law enforcement received an anonymous phone call from a woman stating that she had a love letter sent to Dot by one of her many admirers. Darling Dottie, only 2 more days and I will be in your arms. I want to see you, oh so much, and kiss your pretty toes, it said. The anonymous caller told the police that the man who wrote it was one of the most powerful men in the country. When the author of the letter came forward, investigators finally learned the identity of the mysterious Mr. Marshall. He was actually Philadelphia businessman John Kearsley Mitchell, the son-in-law of a close associate of J.P. Morgan, and that Mr. Wilson was Mitchell's lawyer friend, John H. Jackson. Investigators began to pursue Mitchell as a person of interest. Some conjectured that Dot had tried to blackmail him in some way, so he had her taken care of. When news of Dot's murder became public, Mitchell immediately presented himself to the police for questioning and was cleared because he provided an alibi. Mitchell admitted to penning the letter and having dinner with Dot before she was murdered, but denied having a romantic relationship with her. He claimed he was happily married and his wife was always there to confirm that. Then, why was Mitchell so eager to kiss the toes of someone who he was just friends with? And why were there pajamas at the scene? The love letter paired with the fact that Mitchell's letters were missing from the crime scene and that on the day before the murder, Dot had Mr. Mitchell over for dinner. He came with a bouquet of orchids with a diamond and jade bracelet wrapped around the stems. Wilson and Billy, the maid, left for the evening, and the elevator attendant confirmed that Mr. Marshall left at 2:30 a.m. This means between 2:30 a.m. and 11 a.m., someone gained access to the apartment undetected. The coroner estimated that she died around 6 a.m.
Dot's grieving mother, Kate Keenan, told the police that Marshall was a kind man and he wouldn't hurt anyone. She suspected it was Dot's low-life boyfriend, Guimarães, who had been known to beat her when he didn't get his way. Dot had even told her mother that she didn't want to see Guimarães anymore, so maybe the murder was due to his insane jealousy. The murder brought to light that he had been swindling innocent people into investing in bogus stocks. He was known to run with the mob and there were warrants out for his arrest. The evidence also indicates Dot and Guimarães were working together because at the murder scene, one piece of evidence was a list of quote-unquote suckers in Dot's apartment. Guimarães used several aliases and had reputed ties to the mob. Police rounded Guimarães up at his suite at the Embassy Hotel on the Upper West Side. He had bruises and bite marks on his hand, claiming he had been in a fight the night before. For 9 days, headlines seemed to only be about the Broadway Butterflies murder, but inevitably faded from the presses. The case sat cold and open for years, and law enforcement kept their eye on Guimarães, but Alberto had an airtight alibi. He'd spent the evening with his best friend, Edmund J. McBrien, and a stunning young beauty known only in the press as the Blonde, later released to be named Oriella A. Fisher. She risked her reputation by admitting to spending the night in a hotel with a man and having breakfast together the next morning, but she did it anyways. That man was Alberto, and the police protected her identity. Guimarães claimed he had called Dot at 2:30 a.m., but she didn't answer the phone. The manager of the hotel was not able to find a check signed by Alberto to prove he and Oriella had breakfast that morning, and none of the servers recognized him. Still, she corroborated his alibi, leaving the police with no choice but to release Alberto. A few years later, closer to the end of the Roaring Twenties, Fisher and McBrien attended a party in Washington, D.C. At one point during the night, Fisher took to the balcony for some fresh air. She never came back inside. She either jumped or was pushed, and it was revealed after that she had recently confessed to family members that she perjured herself in the Dot King murder. Her family did not believe her death was a suicide or an accident, and some wonder whether O'Brien pushed her to her death in order to prevent her from disclosing Guimarães' role or his own in Dot's murder. In Oriella's belongings, an affidavit was found swearing that Guimarães had not been with her the night of Dot's death and that she had committed perjury. Fisher's death led to authorities looking at the King case again. In a grand jury investigation, Oriella's mother told the jury that it cost $100,000 to hush up the King case. It was never revealed how Oriella had known this. Ultimately, because all of the unanswered questions were still there, Guimarães wasn't charged. He married and divorced a couple of times. One of his wives claimed he had tried to kill her as well. Alberto died in 1953 at 63 years old without ever admitting to what he knew about Dot's murder. Another surprising and interesting fact that law enforcement looked into was Draper Daugherty, the son of the nation's attorney general. He was nowhere near Manhattan at the time of the crime, but the media took quite an interest in this famous married suspect. It made for good headlines. Another intriguing thing was that the Daugherty connection could have been possibly more significant, because shortly after Dot's murder, someone who knew Daugherty but never identified himself or herself attempted to blackmail him regarding his relationship with the 27-year-old blonde. District Attorney Job Banton and his chief assistant Ferdinand Pecora cleared Draper of any suspicion, and Daugherty fled to Mexico following. When he returned a few weeks later, his wife had declared him inebriate and committed to a Connecticut sanitarium. In June of 1923, Daugherty escaped, climbing into a waiting car, and eventually found his way to Chicago. Another person of interest was the up-and-coming Broadway performer Hilda Fergus, who had been Dot's roommate until just a few weeks before the murder. They were close. They even shared a bed when they lived together. Dot took Hilda to all her usual clubs and speakeasies and introduced her to rich, powerful men. Soon, Hilda was often seen with Willie McCabe, one of the mob giant Arnold Rothstein's cronies. As Hilda gained her claim to fame, she was becoming more successful professionally, making it to Broadway. Hilda eventually moved out of the apartment, claiming that Dot's partying and drinking was just too much for her. Which is funny because a lot of people said that Hilda's lifestyle was even wilder than Dot's. Just days before the murder, there was a report of an altercation between Dot and an unidentified woman on the street. It had been speculated that this might have been Hilda. Hilda had just moved to a building very close by. It's not clear why Hilda would have been angry enough to attack Dot or have her attack her, let alone kill her. But there is at least a possibility that their falling out could have been the motive for the murder. Other suspects have been proposed as Dot's older brother John, who didn't approve of her flapper lifestyle, and also her ex-husband, Eugene Opel, whom she referred to as a big bum. And there's no real evidence that either of them were involved in the death. It has also been suggested that the answer to Dot's mystery could actually lie in the history of the brownstone in which she was murdered. Two of Dot's neighbors in her building, in two different apartments, were named Francis Stoddard and Robert Sanborn. Dot and Guimarães were known to have been involved in some pyramid schemes together, wherein they duped investors out of large amounts of cash. And according to the news article, they even had an office in the Giske building downtown with a fake name that they used as a cover. The name was Stoddard and Sanborn. The most likely explanation is that when they were trying to come up with a name for their front, Dot or Guimarães just thought of these names because they probably recognized them. handy when you're in need of a name in a pinch. Maybe they were printed on mailboxes in the lobby of the building. If the real Stoddard and Sanborn were somehow caught up in their shenanigans, say as investors or partners, this could have provided one or both of them with a motive for violence when they discovered that they had been tricked. It wouldn't be the first time such a thing had happened. About a year earlier, another one of Dot's and Gumir's suckers had also assaulted her in the club. In all of the news reports about Dot King's slaying, the other people in Dot's building are never mentioned by name except for Hilda Ferguson, her former roommate, and the chance mention of the Grahams by the elevator operator. This could be revealing, especially considering that the police theorized that the killer had to be someone that Dot King knew and trusted, since there were no signs of a break-in. The door had been locked when the maid arrived the next morning. Only two people had a key: the maid Billy Bradford, who called the police, and Dot.
Unfortunately, Dot's murder was never solved and no one was ever indicted. Whoever killed the dashing Dot was never brought to justice. To this day, it remains one of the most baffling of all the city's cold case files. Interestingly, no one was ever indicted, and since no charges were ever filed, there are no cold files to warm up. The city's archives have no police records of the investigation of her murder. Some people see this as evidence of a cover-up. The files must have been either removed or destroyed. Others think it was the incompetence of the investigating team. I know it was a different time, and investigations have come a long way since then, but I think it is also suspicious either way you have on the subject. Tell us what you think. Who do you think did this and why? Maybe if the police had been thorough from the start, things would have been different and they would have found the culprit. Obviously, at this time, forensics was not a precise science yet. If the maid hadn't cleaned the crime scene before the police arrived, maybe more evidence could have been recovered. Dorothy King's murder and the murder of Louise Lawson have been referred to as the butterfly murders. They call them Broadway butterflies because they're young women so drawn to the lights of Broadway. They must move toward them like moths to light bulbs. But these two women were no moths. They were so beautiful, we have to change the analogies to butterflies. Dot and Lou flew so close to the lights that they took on their glow themselves. The lights burned so bright in these women that they couldn't be blown out completely. Regardless of their involvement in any various crimes, what happened to them was wrong and they deserved better.
Louise Lawson was 24 years old when she was murdered in her apartment at 22 West 77th Street, around the corner from the Museum of Natural History in Manhattan. Louise Lawson, born Thula Louise Lawson, moved to the city from Walnut Springs, Texas. Louise had enjoyed her childhood as the daughter of wealthy Texans Mr. and Mrs. A.P. Lawson of Walnut Springs. She sang at her local Baptist church every Sunday and became somewhat of a local celebrity, known for being a piano prodigy. Lou had more aspirations for herself and outgrew being a big fish in a tiny pond, and made her way to the Big Apple with big dreams of becoming a star. She wanted to be a movie star. She landed a small part in D.W. Griffith's 1920 film Way Down East, starring Lillian Gish. When her show business career didn't take off like she had hoped, she turned to singing and piano. But her singing career never had the chance to take off either, because in October of 1922, she signed a lease at 22 West 77th Street for a three-bedroom apartment, and the rent was $1,900 per year, about $2,250 per month today. Louise's fifth floor apartment, number 56, was gorgeously decorated and was considered quite extravagant for the times. Prior to the crime, employees of the building said that Lou was never home on the weekends. In January of 1924, there had been 3 burglaries at 22 West 77th Street that occurred quite close together, and this may have been unnerving for a young woman who was living alone. At the time of her murder, she did not work, but did attend music school while her parents provided for her financially, which included Lillian Harvey, Louise's maid, who came every morning around 10 o'clock. She shared an apartment with her best friend, another chorus girl named Charlotte Wakefield. Lou Lawson, who was known for performing private shows for rich men, was found strangled to death in her New York apartment sometime in the morning of February 8, 1924, when 2 men came in her apartment delivering bootleg liquor. The men bound Louise's arms and legs with silk stockings and tied her to the bed with a dog leash, gagged her with Turkish towels, and wrapped a towel around her head and suffocated her. After killing her, they ransacked her apartment. Oddly, from another source, the bondage murders, organized crime in New York City 1923 to 1924, the culprit or culprits bound her hands and feet with surgeon's tape and led police to this, which was the best clue to finding who had killed Lou.
Like Dot King, Lawson's body was discovered by her maid, who had also noticed that about $20,000 worth of jewelry was missing. Again, police assumed that Lawson's death had come as the result of a robbery, but many people still question whether King and Lawson were killed by the same man or men. Louise's murder became front-page news, but the press mainly focused on her personal life. The radiant brunette dated several millionaires who supported her financially. She began having an affair with Gerard M. Dahl, a married investor. He helped pay her rent for her apartment on West 77th Street. She shared the two-bedroom apartment with her dog, Tex. In September of 1923, she attended a yacht party with a tobacco heir, Angler B. Duke, heir to the $5 million estate of Benjamin B. Duke. Tragically, during the evening, Angler fell off the yacht and drowned. The police dubbed these murders as the Butterfly Murders because both victims were beautiful women who were drawn to Broadway. Unfortunately, no one was arrested for Louise's murder, and the case remains unsolved to this day. It is unknown even to this day if the two crimes are linked, but we know them as the Butterfly Murders. The similarities in their deaths lead many people to believe that the murderers were linked. Each of the women came from humble beginnings and found some level of success in New York theater, where they were both introduced to rich and powerful men who were interested in talents other than their acting abilities. In 1932, Dorothy's murder was the inspiration for the 1932 thriller film The King Murder. The movie follows the murder of Miriam King, a fiery young blonde who has made a career of seducing and blackmailing wealthy married men. She is found murdered after demanding a $5,000 payoff from her latest victim, and the detective investigating the case finds out that she was involved in a lot more than just blackmail.
So many things went into this simple, now pet name for an older and financially well off man, as well as one of the longest running production line of caramel candies. Unfortunately, the origin will never truly be as sweet as our delicious candy treats loved by so many. Thanks for listening to this episode of Squared Inceptions. Due to many unforeseen issues regarding the podcast and our lives, we had to delay episodes 1, 2, and 3. Episode 3 will be coming out in about 2 weeks. Our goal is to post episodes every other Wednesday for you, and make sure to follow us on Instagram for clues about the next episode. We hope you join us again